Welcome this afternoon. I'm Luisa del Rosal. I'm the Executive Director of the Mission Foods Texas-Mexico Center. This is our first event of the academic semester. We're really excited to kick it off with such a phenomenal piece of research from two of our research fellows. It really is always a pleasure when we can collaborate with such brilliant minds as the ones that will speak to you today. So be ready with a lot of questions. We will have Q&A available throughout the presentation. If you want to follow up with any of our scholars or connect with the Texas-Mexico Center, please visit our website, SMU Mission Foods Texas-Mexico Center. And now I just get to say hi and pass on the baton to really the heart and soul of the Texas-Mexico Center, and that is my colleague, Jennifer Apurdi, and she will be doing introductions of our fabulous speakers today. Again, if you have any questions, send us a little note through the Q&A, and I look forward to our first event of the year.
Thank you, Luisa, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and for a fascinating discussion about Texas. Why is it exceptional when it comes to business formation, job creation, and migration? Three very, very relevant topics. And before I introduce our speakers, Luisa already mentioned that. I just wanted to say you have a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Start sending us your questions there. We're going to go to them at the end of the session. And now I get the enormous privilege of introducing our fabulous speakers today. We have our senior fellow, Pia Orrenius, vice president and senior economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and our research fellow, Madeline Zavodny, professor of economics at the University of North Florida. Ladies, welcome and thank you for joining us today. We are really, really excited to be presenting the results of your latest research project. I am going to have a conversation with these fabulous ladies a little bit later today, but right now, I will have a couple of questions of my own, but right now I'm going to let you speak to our audience so they can hear all about your findings, and I'll join you back on screen a bit later. Ladies, welcome.
Thank you, Jenny. All right, I guess I'll get started. And Madeline, you're going to correct me. Let me share my screen. You let me know if you can't see it. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that. So thanks for having us, and thanks for the opportunity to share this report that we did for the Texas-Mexico Center. It's been fun. It's fun because Texas regional economy is always interesting, never dull. So we titled this paper Migration, Job Creation, and Business Formation, and Case for Texas Exceptionalism with a question mark, just to sort of keep you guys interested. We don't want to give away any conclusions. All right, so let me get started. And really the motivation for the paper is why Texas grows faster. And so basically we look in this paper back to 2006, so really the last 15 years or so. But if you go back as far as 1990, Texas grows about 1 percentage point faster than the nation, whether it's job growth. We've grown on average annually 2%. In terms of employment since 1990, the nation has grown at about 1%. If you look at GDP growth, we average about 3.6% output growth since 1990 in the state, and the nation about 2.5%. There are a few exceptional years to this pattern, and those are typically oil bust years. So when you have big decreases in the price of oil, there will be a year sometimes that Texas will grow more slowly than the nation, but that's really the exception and not the rule. So in general, number of factors boost Texas growth. Obviously, this paper is about migration and business formation, but let's talk about some of those more fundamental factors that we believe are the reason that Texas tends to grow faster. First of all, geography, central location, our international border, our sea and land ports, and obviously, being next to Mexico in particular. Many large cities, there's quite a bit of economic research showing that large cities are good for growth, productivity growth in particular, and plentiful land, which obviously keeps down the cost of land. Industry mix is important. Some of these are inherent to the region because of sort of the geology of the region, like energies or oil and gas deposits. Some of them are inherent to sort of the fact that we have these international borders. We have trade agreements with Mexico and Canada. So that's really spurred manufacturing and transportation. Of course, manufacturing and transportation are also related to the energy industry, because remember, it's not just the upstream industry, it's the downstream, the petrochemicals, the refining, and so forth, and also there's the high-tech industry, which has also become a really important part of the diversification of the Texas economy, really since the 1990s. Around these sort of first order industries have grown up a huge service industry, which is a lot of what we have here in Dallas, in North Texas in general, finance and insurance, business services, and then of course the construction industry as well. It supports the development of all these other sectors. Population of Texas tends to be a little bit younger than the nation on average, and fast growing. And that's typically due to high birth rates, but also net in-migration. And lastly, public policies are important for economic growth. So whatever policies are preserving more open and flexible markets are really correlated with faster growth. Some of these things may be less regulation, for example. Also things that attract firms and workers, like relatively low taxes. To the extent that these also contribute to low cost of living and a favorable business climate, these are the things that bring firms and people in. All right, so with that backdrop, let's talk about migration, because that's really the focus of the study. So the motivation is Texas grows faster. Then the second observation we make is migration really is a very key element of this growth, and it's something that can change a lot, from year to year. It could change very quickly. We need to understand it better. So really migration here, our questions are, first of all, how large exactly is migration to the state and its metros? And when we look at migration, are we looking at net flows, which is, inflows minus outflows? Do we get a different answer if we look at inflows versus outflows versus net flows? And you'll see that we are actually going to get a slightly, something we weren't expecting, a surprising answer. Because usually we're looking at net flows. We're just looking at what's the net that we're gaining from other states or other countries. And then that's sort of what we run with. But it can be very interesting dynamics around net, depending on what's happening with inflows versus outflows. We also look at flows versus rates, because you're going to see when you control for the size of the state, the size of our population, you get a slightly different ranking of migration, results among states when you look at rates versus levels. We talk in the report a little bit about why people come. That's going to make a big difference. So if you look at Florida, for example, Florida is a big net in-migration state, but people go there to retire. So it's not as relevant for economic growth. So for Texas, we look at sort of why do people say they come, and we think it's correlated with economic growth, and it is actually. It's the state, with one of the highest percentages of people who say they come for a job. Next, we're going to look at how is this migration related to business formation and job growth. So this is going to be introducing another data set to sort of the migration data and looking at business entries versus exits and job growth in those businesses, job creation versus job destruction. And the reason we need this to sort of complete the picture is because if you have a lot of migration, you better be having a lot of job growth. We need capital to go with the labor to create the output. If you just think of just the very basic economics, what we call, economic jargon, the production function, we need capital and labor together. So so that's why in this paper, we take time to look really at this other side of the ledger, which is the business formation side. And with that comes the job creation side. And then last thing we do is talk a little bit about the implications for the state's long-term growth outlook. and for public policy. It's sort of not very in-depth analysis, but just sort of raising some points, things that we need to think about as we go forward. All right. So first of all, what are the benefits of migration really for growth, or how does migration lead to growth? More specifically, well, migrants clearly, especially when they're coming to work, they're boosting the population and the workforce. Depending on their, their aptitude, their skill levels, their educational attainment and so forth, they can reduce the labor market bottlenecks that may be existing in local economies where there's just a lack of a certain type of worker, for whether it's by occupation, industry, by skill. And so this migration can address these skill mismatches, these labor market bottlenecks, especially when the economy is growing quickly. So what we see is that states that consistently grow faster than the nation are typically relying on worker in-migration. It's very hard to grow faster than the nation on a consistent basis without drawing in that extra labor. The other thing about the labor influx, and I kind of talked about this already, but the labor influx, because it's more workers, it increases the return to capital or the return to investment. So it really should boost business investment. And so although we don't observe business investment directly in the data, we do observe business formation and job creation, as I mentioned. So that's the other piece of the puzzle. And so we better be sure that it's there as well. Okay, so what data are we looking at for this study? We're looking over the period 2006 to 2018. We're relying on what's called the American Community Survey, which is a very large survey. It's annual, nationally representative. It's about 1% of US households that are surveyed each year. We use this ACS data to create measures of domestic migration. And so we're typically going to measure that adults ages 20 to 54 who lived in another state a year ago. That's going to be our measure of migration between states. And so just to give you an idea, during the period that we're looking at, Texas averaged 76,000 net migrants in this age group per year. Florida averaged 28,000 in this age group per year. So Texas is by far attracting the largest number of migrants. Florida is second. California, negative 45,000 per year during this period of time in terms of domestic outmigration. So they're losing people each year, as they move to other states. And then New York is even bigger, negative 79,000 per year during the period that we're looking at. Now, for most of the years during our period, California and New York are making up for the population loss to domestic migration with international migration. What was interesting in 2020, though, is that fell through. And so actually in 2020, we see that they did not have enough international immigration to make up for their domestic migration losses. And so their populations actually shrunk. Okay, international migration, we also look at this. We don't go into a lot of detail on this, but we have, it's trickier with international migration because obviously when they leave the country, they're no longer in our data. So we have international in-migration from 2006, so for every year in our data, but the net international migration, we have to do some special things to derive that measure, and so we just have that for 2010 to 2018. The business data is coming from the Business Dynamics Statistics data set, which tracks really all non-farm private sector business establishments in the US. And here we're going to be able to see openings, closings of businesses, and with that, the jobs that are created, and when they close, the jobs that are destroyed. All right, let me show you some of these results that we've seen. Okay, so here is large states, and this is the net domestic migration rate among large states in the US. And you see in most years, Texas in red there, in most years, Texas is the top state in terms of net domestic migration rate. So we're attracting among the large states, we have the highest net domestic migration rate, except we slip under in 2015 and 2016, we slip under Florida. And remember, I told you oil bust years are a bit different than normal years. And so obviously 2015, we're coming, oil prices had fallen very severely in the fall of 2014. They were low and falling in 2015. And we really didn't come back until 2017 from that oil shock. So that does affect actually the net domestic migration rate. But generally Texas is top among the large states. And then here you can see that in terms of California and New York, you know, they're consistently negative in the sense that people are consistently moving out on average from California and New York, moving to other states. The interesting thing, though, is that this was kind of our surprise result, is that, you know, I just showed you net migration. Now I'm showing you gross in migration. So this is not subtracting out migrants. This is the in-migration rate, just people coming in. So gross in-migration rate into Texas. And we were very surprised to see this because it's actually below the national average. So you see the Texas red line is below the blue line, which means that our gross domestic in-migration rate is below the rest of the US. You say, how is this possible? How is it possible that we don't really have very high gross in-migration, a very high gross in-migration rate if we're one of the top net in-migration, states? Well, the reason is this. We have the nation's lowest domestic out-migration rate. So the reason we have such a high net in-migration is because we have such low out-migration, which means what Madeline and I are calling this, we are the stickiest state in the nation. So earlier, the Dallas Fed, we'd looked at this question in one of our publications, and I think something like 82% of people born in Texas still live in Texas. And so that makes us the stickiest state in the nation, which means that people who are born here tend to stay here. And then in addition, people that move here also tend to stay here. So we're very good at retaining people who come here or who are born here. So we have this very, very low out-migration rate. But this is going to have some policy implications because it means that, you know, we're not just relying on in-migration for our growth, we're relying on the lack of out-migration for our growth. So think about that, and we'll get to your questions about that at the end. Of course, from Mexico, it's true that we see more in-migration from Mexico than any other state. And so you can see that here. And that's not surprising, but it's really important. It has been declining, though, as you can tell over time. Turning to the job creation data, so this is now the BDS data, and so again, we're looking for higher, above average job creation rates in Texas to go with our above average net migration rates, and the data is cooperating. So here you see that Texas does tend to have higher net job creation rate than the rest of the US. So that's positive. Again, it does sort of slip down a little bit during or right after the oil bust 2015, 2016. But in general, we have a higher net job creation rate. And importantly, that's due both to high job creation rate and low job destruction rate. Okay, so it's not that we have, what we see with migration, these different patterns for job creation and job destruction. We have high job creation rate and we have a low job destruction rate. So it's very positive news on the business formation side when you look more closely at these data. When we talk about job creation in the report, we take a moment to sort of look at job growth by wage quartile, just to sort of check and see that, some of the criticism that, we get sometimes or we hear about Texas is that, sure, Texas is creating jobs, but it's all minimum wage jobs or jobs that people generally don't want to take, or et cetera, et cetera. But every time we look at this, we sort of get the same result. We find that this job creation premium in Texas is really, consistent across wage quartiles. So in every wage quartile here, what we did is actually measure job growth in the lowest wage quartile. This is for the period that we're looking at, from 2006 to 2018. And so we see that in the lowest job quartile, we have quite a bit of job growth, and the nation didn't have, the rest of the nation didn't really grow that wage quartile. But then in the lower, the upper middle, and the highest wage quartiles, we also had outsized growth, job growth in Texas as compared with the rest of the nation. That means that we're growing we're growing employment in the lowest, in the middle, and also in the highest. And you can see that the differentials are quite sizable even in the upper middle and the highest wage quartile. So I think the notes to the chart here have sort of give you an idea of what the wages are, but the lowest wage quartile is really jobs that pay up to about $9.37 an hour. And then the lower middle is like up to 16, and then the other one is up to 27, and then the highest wage quartile is really about $30 per hour, and up. So healthy. So the signs are that employment growth is healthy across the wage distribution. It's not just concentrated at the bottom. So I told you that we have in the data, it's clear that there's a higher job creation rate in Texas than the rest of the US on average. Next, we look at whether that's related to business formation. And so here we see also that in terms of establishment entry rate, so this is startups, this is new businesses, per 100, so new businesses per 100 existing establishment is our definition of the establishment entry rate. And you can see again here that consistently Texas has a higher establishment entry rate than the rest of the US. So that's also a very positive result in terms of the resilience of the Texas economy. I guess the distressing news is that both of these lines are sort of trending down over time. And there is a big discussion, in academia and outside in the private sector as well, in terms of why is business dynamism declining? Because that's surely what this captures. I mean, it may be higher in Texas, but it's falling here as well over time. So that is a concern. What are the factors that are really pushing startups down and reducing, business dynamism? That was establishment entry rates. This is establishment exit rates. And as I mentioned earlier, we typically have lower establishment exit rates. And so you can see that here. The rest of the US typically has higher establishment exit rates. These are kind of business failures. These are the rate at which businesses are going out of business. And you can see, obviously, they spiked in the Great Recession or right after the Great Recession, although less so here in Texas. Of course, Texas here, they spiked a bit again in the oil bust in 2015, 2016. And we did have hundreds of energy firms that went out of business as a result of the oil bust in those 2 years. Okay, when you correlate, the idea again is that these migration measures and the business formation measures are supposed to be positively correlated. They're happening at the same time. Businesses are being created, absorbing this labor influx that's coming into the state. Well, do you see that in the data? So here we're basically plotting the net domestic migration rate against the net establishment entry rate. So this is really business formation against migration. And then here you can see from that sort of line in the middle, it's a positively sloped line that sort of captures the positive relationship between business formation and migration. Where is Texas? We've circled Texas. It's really kind of close to the top. It has really the second highest net establishment entry rate. So we rank very highly on business formation on net. And then, again, we have a high net domestic migration rate, although there are plenty of smaller states that have higher domestic migration rates than we do, like Nevada, Colorado, Oregon, state of Washington, Arizona are higher than we are. But in terms of the combination of business formation and migration, Texas is right up there and really is an outlier, especially in terms of business formation. So it's just, if there's an exceptionalist story, this is kind of it. I think this is exceptionalism here, as well as exceptionalism in the result I told you earlier about the low out-migration rate, which is part of the reason that's driving this high net migration rate. Let me just show you before I conclude what we saw for the cities. So here's for the metros. The highest net migration rates are in Austin and Dallas, really. And then the lowest, you know, and typically negative are along the border. So we have net outmigration from the border cities in many of these years. And then, you know, you can see that San Antonio slipped just in the final year in 2018. But generally, you know, Texas metros are net, you know, attracting migrants on net. And then how do they perform in terms of business formation? So this is net establishment entry rate, or these are the startup statistics for the metros. And you can see it's not surprising that Austin is on top with the high-tech industry. In particular, there's a lot of startups in the high-tech industry, a lot of new businesses associated with that sector. So there you go. That's not a surprising result. It's as it should be. And then we have quite a bit of business formation also, obviously, in the rest of the metros. They're clumped pretty close together. So there's not a lot of differentiation. Really, the standout story here is Austin. And typically when I show any charts about the regional economy, Austin is the standout. All right, so let me summarize, and we'll get to your questions. So what we saw in this report is that Texas draws really the highest number of prime working age domestic migrants of any state, and the highest number of Mexican immigrants of any state. Texas has the highest net migration, both in terms of number and rate, among the large states. But some of the smaller states have higher migration rates. So once you adjust for the population size, like I said, states like Colorado, Arizona, state of Washington, those places have higher migration rates than Texas on average during the period that we're looking at. Our surprise finding was this finding that our high net migration rate is really not driven by outsized in-migration into our state from other states, but by having the nation's lowest out-migration. So nobody's leaving, which means that not as many people have to come in, you know, for your net migration rate to look really good. So we really have a combination of, you know, yes, lots of people are coming, but we are a huge state. So when you measure it as a rate, you know, it may not look that large. But because we have such low out-migration, we really end up with an outsized net migration rate. So like I told you, then our conclusion is Texas is the stickiest state in the nation. And this really explains a lot of what we see on the migration data. Texas also had among the highest establishment entry rates among the states, and also a below average exit rate. So businesses tend to be starting up, and they tend to be succeeding, you know, relative to the national averages. And then we have above average job creation in those businesses and below average job destruction. So that story all gels with the migration story. So that's good. Positive correlation between business formation, the job creation, and the migration is clear from the data. So we went over that scatter plot, and it sort of looks like you'd hope it would. Of course, we realize the causality is running both ways in this data. I mean, people come because there's business formation and jobs available, but as they come, you know, and bring their money and add to the consumption base, they're also, you know, contributing to growth of more businesses and so forth. So really, it's kind of a virtuous cycle. And then, of course, international immigration is extremely important too. Although I will say, during the period that we're looking at is kind of an unusual period, because it's a period during which domestic migration becomes more important than international immigration to Texas. Before 2006, or really before 2005, international immigration was larger than domestic migration, and then that switched. So during the period that we're looking at, domestic migration really has become more important in terms of adding to the population. Policy implications, well, so you have a sticky state. What does that mean? Well, if you are keeping your people, it really argues for investing in your people. So think about however you invest in people, whether it's education, whether it's health, and policies really that affect their outcomes and their labor market outcomes in particular. All those things may matter more when workers are homegrown. So if you're a sticky state, it really pays to invest in the people, that are from here, because they're going to stay. So that's important. What about relying on domestic migration? Well, there we are raising some concerns because, like I said, we've been relying more and more on domestic migration over time. But here's the problem. The rest of the nation is aging. We're aging. The baby boomers are retiring in the rest of the nation as well as here. When people are older, they move less. When people are older, they innovate less. They work less. They're less likely to start businesses. There's a number of issues that come with an aging population and aging workforce. And so it also means that we're going to have, less of an opportunity to pull from the rest of the nation over time. So really, I think one of the big takeaways of this study is really, where the worker is going to come from in the future. And we really need to get back to this idea that we're going to have to pull internationally. We're going to have to do immigration reform. We need better policies on immigration in order to attract and retain international workers. There's a number of things that Madeline and I have written about this, and we can talk about it in more detail. But I think if we want to grow, like we have in the past, this is really is where we're going to have to think more about how we're going to do international immigration and kind of resurrect it, because it went into a bit of a lull here in the last few years. All right, that concludes our formal remarks. I'm going to stop sharing here and we can start the discussion. All right.
Thank you so much. These are great insights. And like I mentioned, I have several questions, and I know slowly and surely our audience will also start in with their own questions, but I'm going to take advantage right now because, of course, lately we've all been living through a pandemic and that happened in 2020. We see that your data is through 2018, but how do you think these patterns have changed since then, given the said pandemic and all the other changes that have been occurring in Mexico and Texas as well?
Well, I think I'll start, Madeline, and then you can pick up. But I think we've been surprised. So the data is not super timely, but what we've been able to glean, and I actually have a colleague, Yi-Chen Su, who's looked at really timely data using the Consumer Credit Panel from the New York Fed. But from that data, from other data like the cell phone data where they sort of gauge your location and if you're moving from state to state based on where your cell phone is and where you're making your transactions on credit cards and so forth. Based on that data, what we've seen in the pandemic is sort of a continued pattern of mobility and a continued trend into Texas. And so we really haven't seen, there was during the pandemic, maybe the first couple of months, a pause, but then we really saw a resumption of in-migration. We've seen that among people. We've also seen that among firms. So this last year, among corporations, at least, we saw an unprecedented number of corporate relocations into Austin. So that's also related to sort of the booming high-tech industry, which is related to the pandemic and the work from home. So really, we saw a continuation of the patterns of mobility in the pandemic as we'd seen before. And I would say in some cases, maybe even an acceleration.
Absolutely, that Texas's traditional reputation as having a light regulatory touch, low cost of living, as workers who were able to now work remote started thinking more about other options than being so close to work, Texas became even more attractive. And so as we start to get more data on that, I think we will see that trend play out in states like Texas.
Well, thank you. I'm going to go back to a point you mentioned. You mentioned how aging and retiring population is a factor that could potentially affect, the state's business dynamism. You also mentioned how international migration could be an alternative, and hence the importance of immigration reform. But how long do you think it'll be before we start feeling this effect of this aging and retiring population?
I mean, we're already feeling it, really. I mean, we're kind of dodging it because we have had all this in-migration into Texas, so we're kind of like experiencing it maybe, but not feeling it. We looked recently at birth rates, for example, and we're going to come out with a blog from the Dallas Fed on birth rates, and saw this very sharp decline in birth rates in Texas. In fact, it's falling faster since 2000, since the mid 2000s, falling faster in Texas than it is in the US. And that's because birth rates are falling so fast among Hispanic women. But what maybe we're not feeling that pain. Well, first of all, it takes them like 20 years or more to like grow up and be productive. But again, with all this domestic in-migration that we've been experiencing from the rest of the nation, we're kind of dodging that bullet for now, but it's gonna come back and hit us. I mean, we're experiencing it. We have slower population growth as well in Texas over time. Again, we're making up for it with this migration, but that can't go on forever. Other states are going to catch on, and they're going to kind of work to retain their population and slow the outflow, obviously. And so it really is, it's a competition for resources, and really the main resources are people.
To me, as somebody who doesn't live in Texas, one of the really interesting things about it is how its demographics are different from a lot of the rest of the country, particularly out of the Southwest, thinking about the state's Hispanic population. I think traditionally Hispanic women have had more children, higher fertility rates than most other demographic groups. But Hispanic women have been the group that have experienced the steepest decline in their fertility rates over the last few years, even pre-pandemic. And so if this continues, given the disproportionate, relative to the rest of the country, share of women in Texas who are Hispanic, in 20 years, that does mean that the population is going to look not as big as it would have been if things had been different. And so I think that looking ahead, all states should be worried about their population aging, but maybe Texas has a little, and New Mexico and Southern California will see that a little bit differently than the rest of the country, and worse.
Okay, I don't want to monopolize. I'm going to start sending you some questions from our audience. Let's start with, what effect will the policies, laws recently passed by the Texas legislature have? And specifically thinking of Oregon announcing no public travel.
What an appropriate question that I can't answer. Madeline, I'm gonna let you answer that question. The only thing I'm gonna say is what we have been doing. We're looking at an earlier period of time. What we have been doing in Texas has been working. Texas was always a moderate state. When we wrote our book about the Texas economy called The 10-Gallon Economy, we made it a point, to say that whether it was immigration or other policies, Texas was very middle of the road. We never took really one extreme or the other. And so that worked for us. I think it was part of sort of the exceptionalism, part of the magic that sort of created this job engine. And so as to the future, not sure. Madeline, maybe you can speak to it.
It is too early to know what's going to happen. You could think that maybe there's going to be a change in who is willing to move to Texas and who stays in Texas. What is an outsider, if I were in Texas and a policymaker there, what I might be most concerned about would be whether the tech industry that has been an important part of economic growth, particularly in Austin, but throughout the state, and is a source of not only those jobs, but then creates lots of other jobs as high income people come in, or people homegrown in Texas get these high income jobs and spend their money. Whether those tech firms will stay or continue to move to Texas, that's an industry that I think might be a bellwether. If you're thinking about, other examples that we could look at to see what has happened in the recent past when states have done things that some groups might disagree with, North Carolina would be the group that sort of comes to mind, or the state that comes to mind that has adopted some policies that have been of concern to groups a few years ago. And there was a lot of talk about not traveling there, the NCAA not doing tournaments there, and so on. And I'm not sure that we really saw a big drop in migration, but the pandemic has changed all of these patterns, and it's very hard to know what's going to happen.
Thank you. We have two, I think, similar questions. The audience also wants to know, what makes Texas so sticky? As you mentioned, the stickiest state in the nation. How can it be? And one question particularly, especially when we're talking about immigration, but overall, what makes it so sticky?
So I think the main reason Texas is sticky is because people think it's a country. I mean, it has, why move away? If there's good opportunity here and good economic mobility, and a reasonable cost of living, and your family's here, I don't see a lot of reason why you'd move away. And so I think really the fact that we've had a low cost of living and we've had economic opportunity is really what's retained people. It's also what's brought people in. I do see that somebody's asking, though, about the role of this relatively low cost of living, and that's kind of being eroded currently. So we did cite some numbers in our report that show, the cost of living is actually increasing here, but it's also increasing elsewhere. So still, compared to other large states, we're still relatively affordable. But compared to other smaller states, we're less and less affordable, and certainly housing costs have really gone up quite a bit here in the last year. Madeline.
Well, as a non-Texan, I can't really say a lot about that, I don't think. But yes, the low housing costs have been so important. And it's going to just be really interesting to watch as we see the pandemic continue and hopefully end, whether companies continue with generous remote work policies, and then how that affects places like Texas and states that are attractive because of a low cost of living. That may end, and we may see more of these agglomeration economies that Pia talked about before, of people being very attracted to large cities, resuming like it was for decades before.
Now, here's another question, and this one's regarding, economic growth. You mentioned, how it's one of the key factors as a driver for migration. I'm going to relate it to something that we keep seeing very lately in everyday life. And Madeline, you'll tell us if this is a case in Florida or not, but here lately, we've been seeing that certain industries are experiencing or have been saying that they're facing a certain labor shortage, especially, service industry, which, like you mentioned, is very common here in North Texas. How do you think that will impact the future of Texas economic growth, if it will, or if you think it will, or if it does? And if so, what do you think might be the cause for this? I'm not sure if I'm using the correct term of labor shortage, but we are hearing from people in certain industries saying, we can't fill these jobs right now. Will that be something that you think will affect this Texas business dynamism? Do you feel it's affecting it right now? What can you tell us about that?
Absolutely, it's affecting us right now. The thing is, that's not really part of the exceptionalism story in the sense that it's going on really all over the nation. And so the labor shortages are severe. And we've seen, wages increasing and prices increasing. And we're hearing really unprecedented complaints from businesses in our surveys at the Dallas Fed, for example, about the difficulty hiring. And really, when we ask them what's the main reason for the difficulty hiring, they say it's just a lack of applicants, like literally nobody's applying. And so that's really the main reason they can't hire. And really something like, I believe it's, 70% of our businesses we talk to in our surveys say they're actively trying to hire. So which is like a record high share of firms trying to hire. So this is not a story about Texas. It's really a story about the nation in this pandemic recovery. It's about, very strange combination of a lot of fiscal stimulus, strong demand, supply disruptions, and just, a lot of reluctance on behalf of people to go back to work. I mean, fear of infection is a huge problem. Childcare, can you really safely send your children to school? Currently, it's not clear. So are you keeping them home? So childcare is a big impediment as well. And so, and we also hear that people are sort of reevaluating their careers. Do they really want to return to the job that they've left? Do they want to, do some reskilling, some training, some different, and take a different tack? Look for something else. And so I think we're sort of in a labor market upheaval at the moment, and labor shortages is a big piece of it.
Absolutely. And I think that this is happening across so much of the country. A few weeks ago, I actually texted Pia on a Saturday morning. On Saturday mornings, I sometimes go get a Chick-fil-A biscuit, and the Chick-fil-A near me was closed. And they had a huge sign up saying, "We can't get workers. We are closed Saturday mornings." Good night. What are we coming to when I can't get my Chick-fil-A biscuit? So it is a problem across so much of the United States. And I think that it's been interesting to see that in the states like Texas and Florida, where the pandemic unemployment insurance extension ended early, that didn't relieve it as much as businesses were perhaps hoping, for the reasons Pia was talking about. If your kid's school is closing on and off, or at least their classroom is closing, or your kid's being told to quarantine because of an exposure, how are you going to work when you don't know, about reliable childcare as well? One thing that, thinking to one of the data sets that we analyzed for this report, the Business Dynamics Survey, our Business Dynamic Statistics Survey, comes out with a big lag, but it's going to be really interesting to see when we get 2020 and 2021 data, if suddenly there were lots of new businesses, small businesses being created. Because what I see here in Florida is lots of people who used to have a job that didn't pay them a whole lot more than minimum wage, that they were earning well below $15 an hour, and they weren't necessarily getting hours that were family friendly or flexible, that were being dictated them when they had to show up, that those people decided with COVID to go out on their own and start some small business, often of making food and selling it to their friends, or making something. And it sort of pushed a group of people into entrepreneurship who otherwise might not have been. So it's going to be really interesting to see, as the pandemic hopefully ebbs, do they stay entrepreneurs, or do they go back to work for bigger businesses? And when is Chick-fil-A going to be open on Saturday mornings?
For the sake of that biscuit, let's hope very soon. Well, I'm glad to hear that this overall situation hopefully doesn't have to do or won't affect Texas exceptionalism, as we've heard. Fantastic research and fantastic story, we believe. And another factor, since you mentioned Mexico, how do you feel Mexico will keep on tying in to the Texas exceptionalism story? Do you see it? We heard you mention, Mexico's migration, not only to the US, but also to Texas, is kind of on a downturn. Do you see that kind of ending very short term? Do you think it's going to take a while? Do you think it would be more beneficial to look into immigration reform policies that would help, both sides? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, great question, Jenny. So on Mexico, I mean, we've seen a decline after the Great Recession. We saw a big decline in immigration from Mexico, not just, into the US in general and even into Texas, although much less so here than elsewhere. But I guess what's going to happen in the future, certainly we could do a lot with Mexico in terms of immigration reform. We could certainly have better, more well-run temporary worker programs where, they could bring seasonal workers in on a more consistent basis and without sort of these, fairly low quotas that we currently have. But the other thing, the other thing that we're seeing and sort of what we don't know yet is that, so the Mexican economy is not doing well. So they're recovering from the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, they were growing very slowly. In fact, they had several years of negative growth. They're not growing quickly now. They're not recovering their jobs nearly as fast as they should. There's a number of problems with the Mexican economy at the moment. And the open question is this going to really push, rekindle migration more on the order of what we used to see before the Great Recession? So there could be, and there is a little bit of evidence of that some of this Mexican migration is coming back. You'd have to look really at Border Patrol statistics and that type of thing to see. It looks like a resurgence in Mexican migration of the undocumented kind. Of course, it'd be better to have it the documented kind. So really we can work with this situation really with immigration reform, but also the thing we have to keep an eye on is the Mexican economy. And so to the extent that it's not growing very fast, and certain regions of Mexico are not growing at all, that's certainly going to push people out to a greater extent than has been the case really in the last 10 years.
One of the really interesting patterns that we've seen build slowly over like the last 7 years or so is a shift from who's coming from not so much, Mexico dropped off, as Pia said before, in about 2005, but the buildup of migrants from the Northern Triangle of El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua coming. And I don't know that those migrants are staying as much in Texas, even if they enter through Texas. And so watching what happens there and thinking about just because there's large flows initially coming into Texas doesn't mean that those migrants are going to stay in Texas is interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point.
A lot of food for thought, and we've covered migration, labor, business. What don't we cover in this exceptional state? And thank you for presenting this exceptional research to us.
Well, I just want to come in and say I get to spoil the fun of a great conversation, but being respectful of everybody's time and thanking our amazing researchers, Pia, Madeline, thank you so much for everything you do for the Texas Mexico Center. I think you guys are exceptional. So if anything, I think we clarified today that we have two amazing and exceptional researchers that support the Texas Mexico Center, and Jenny did a fantastic job with the questions. I want to thank the audience for joining us. I know this just starts more conversation, and I hope you join us for the next event in our newsletter. Join us, send us an email, texasmexico@smu.edu, so you can hear of upcoming events, catch the highlights from today. Always join us on Twitter. There's a conversation going on there on all the facts that we learned today. So again, on behalf of the Texas Mexico Center, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the fabulous Jenny, and for everybody for joining us. We are adjourned.